Do you like to study African history? Perhaps you care more so about the scramble for it. Or, just maybe, you are simply looking to enjoy food with YouTube. Regardless, you are here, and you are ready to listen to somebody yap about something you think might be interesting. And that something is a little place called Rhodesia. Though apparently they call it Zimbabwe now.
Do we?
So to start us off, let's go all the way back to 1889. The British government agreed that the British South Africa Company, which we will affectionately refer to as BSAC, under one Cecil Rhodes, would assume control of a swath of southern African land, that it would include the area soon to be southern Rhodesia. Fast forward to 1920, and it's clear now to the British government BSAC rule is becoming clearly impractical for a variety of reasons, but none are truly relevant to what we're getting at. Fast forward a little bit more to September 12, 1923, and Britain decides it will now annex southern Rhodesia outright. A month later, on October 1st, 1923, the first constitution for the new British colony goes into effect. Jumping ahead to after World War II, calls for independence from European rule are quickly growing across all of Africa. In response, the UK created what was called the Central African Federation. This was made up of the nations of Northern Rhodesia, Southern Rhodesia, and Nyasaland. The goal was to create something akin to Australia, Canada, or South Africa, but ultimately this federation would be very short-lived and dissolved by 1964. It was then that both Northern Rhodesia and Nyasaland were granted independence and became the nations of Zambia and Malawi, respectively. When this occurred, Southern Rhodesia was forced to make a decision: remain under British rule until they granted majority rule to the black population, or break and become an independent country. And in 1965, they did just that, with the government of Rhodesia making what is called the Unilateral Declaration of Independence, or its more common name, U.D.I. Following U.D.I., the UN Security Council passed a resolution calling for states to not recognize Rhodesia, and imposing extensive economic and political sanctions on the new country. These sanctions included embargoes on arms, oil, and numerous other critical supplies. There was a clear driving force behind the UN's decision. Rhodesia's government was controlled by the white minority. But the white minority feared something akin to the Mau Mau Rebellion, or perhaps the mass instability that had overwhelmed the Congo, would take hold in Rhodesia if governance suddenly became majority rule. This fear was why Britain hadn't granted independence, and instead, the Rhodesian Front, the ruling party, declared independence. This then warrants us taking a look at Rhodesia's government itself. The electoral system that Rhodesia used was constructed in a way that inherently disenfranchised the black majority. Voting requirements included high property and income thresholds, effectively excluding most black voters and all voters who didn't make a lot of money, which was quite a few considering the average annual income in Rhodesia in 1964 was 319 Rhodesian pounds. Additionally, even those black voters who met the qualifications could only hold a limited number of seats in the legislature. For example, A-roll voters needed an annual income of at least 792 Rhodesian pounds, or property worth 1,650 pounds, with reductions based on education. The majority of A-roll voters were European whites. B-roll voters had lower requirements, number-wise, but were primarily African as a result of the wealth threshold. These factors, amongst some others, caused African nationalists to be quite successful in discouraging voter registration among black Rhodesians. Speaking of the nationalists, let's introduce our new players: the Zimbabwe African People's Union, or ZAPU, and the Zimbabwe African National Union, ZANU, led by Joshua Nkomo and Robert Mugabe respectively, emerged with their militant wings ZIPRA and ZANLA. ZIPRA had the support of the Soviets, and ZANLA had the support of the Chinese, injecting Cold War dynamics into the conflict. Rhodesian forces, unofficially, were supported by primarily South Africa. In April 1966, the first major clash occurred between Rhodesian security forces and ZANLA guerrillas in what became known as the Battle of Sonoya. This would mark the beginning of armed resistance and set the stage for the conflict. The following year, ZIPRA, in collaboration with South African ANC guerrillas, launched operations in the Wanki and Sipolilo areas. These campaigns would hold significance in the early conflict because, despite ultimately being repelled by the RSF, they demonstrated the capability and coordination of the guerrilla forces. By 1968, guerrilla incursions were increasing, targeting infrastructure such as railways, roads, and farms, with hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of landmines being placed along roads, which would kill hundreds of civilians. The Rhodesian government responded with harsher counterinsurgency measures, including increased militarization in the rural areas, and in 1969, the Rhodesian government introduced a new constitution that further entrenched minority rule. This constitution was ultimately rejected by the international community, but underscored the government's commitment to maintaining control. In response, the British government established what's called the Purse Commission in 1970, which was to gauge African opinion on a proposed settlement, which was met with overwhelming rejection by Black Rhodesians, and highlighted a rather deep-seated opposition to any form of governance that did not include majority rule. By 1971, guerrilla warfare was intensifying even further, with Zipper and Zanla increasing their attacks on Rhodesian security forces, infrastructure, and civilian targets. The rural population was facing severe disruptions, with many forced into protected villages, which were known as keeps, to isolate guerrillas from their support bases. The Rhodesian government launched Operation Hurricane, aimed at securing the northern and eastern borders to cut off insurgent supply lines, and while some successes were had, the insurgents' mobility and support from neighboring countries made the operation only partially effective in the end. In 1972, the guerrilla war escalated significantly with the launch of the Zanla and Zipper joint offensive. This period saw increased coordination between the two groups and more sophisticated attacks. By 1974, the political landscape in the region shifted, with the Portuguese withdrawal from Mozambique, which now became a key base for the guerrilla fighters. The Frelimo government in Mozambique supported the Zimbabwean nationalist cause, providing sanctuaries and supply routes for the guerrilla fighters. With Portugal now withdrawn from Mozambique, the international isolation of Rhodesia grew, with sanctions and embargoes tightening. There was now no country in the world that would trade with Rhodesia. And despite international pressure, South Africa continued to provide material support to Rhodesia. This included military equipment, intelligence sharing, and economic aid. Though its own international pressures and internal challenges limited this aid, the Rhodesian economy was now really starting to feel the grip of these embargoes, with shortages and economic hardships for all citizens. This economic strain contributed to increasing internal dissent and calls for meaningful negotiations to end the conflict. In 1976, U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger attempted to mediate the conflict, putting pressure on South Africa to influence Rhodesia towards negotiations. Kissinger's efforts would lead to the Geneva Conference, which ultimately did not result in an agreement, but did set the stage for future negotiations. This period saw some of the most intense fighting, with both sides vying heavily for more power at the negotiating table. The Rhodesian government launched major offensives, such as Operation Dingo and Operation Ellen, targeting guerrilla bases in Mozambique and Zambia. Despite these efforts, the insurgents' guerrilla tactics and international support kept them resilient. In 1977, Prime Minister Ian Smith announced he was prepared to negotiate with African nationalists, marking a significant shift in his stance. This led to the formation of the Internal Settlement in 1978, which created a transitional government with limited African participation. Black Rhodesians would be given 2/3 of the legislature, but the military, police, civil service, and judiciary would remain in white hands. Bishop Abel Mazorawea became Prime Minister of the newly named Zimbabwe Rhodesia. However, this settlement was rejected by ZANU and ZAVU and the entire international community, including the United Nations, as it did not offer full majority rule. Through 1978 and 79, the conflict intensified even further. Guerrilla forces would increase their attacks ever harder, and the Rhodesian government responded with more aggressive military campaigns. The economic and social pressures on Rhodesia again continued to mount, leading to even greater internal dissent and more international condemnation. The sustained violence and lack of political progress would keep the country in a very cyclical state of turmoil. By late 79, it became clear that a lasting solution required genuine negotiations involving all major parties. Amidst escalating violence and increasing international pressure, the British government, under new Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, facilitated the Lancaster House negotiations in London. These negotiations were intense and involved the representatives from the Rhodesian government, ZANU, ZAPU, and the British government. The Lancaster House Conference began in September 1979. Key issues included, but weren't limited to, the future constitution, land reform, the transition to majority rule, and the security arrangements during the transition period. But the parties did eventually agree to a comprehensive settlement. A key aspect to this agreement was a ceasefire, which included the establishment of assembly points for guerrilla fighters and monitoring by British forces to ensure compliance. The new constitution, drafted during the conference, provided for democratic elections and majority rule, with specific protections for minority rights and a framework for land reform based on a willing buyer, willing seller principle funded by the UK. And in December 1979, the Lancaster House Agreement was signed, paving the way for internationally recognized independence for not Rhodesia, but Zimbabwe. The agreement stipulated that elections would be held in early 1980 under British supervision to ensure a fair and free process. Now, whether or not they were truly, free and fair, that's up for debate, but historically speaking, These elections were crucial for legitimizing the new government and ensuring a peaceful transition. In February 1980, Zimbabwe would hold its first democratic elections, which resulted in a decisive victory for Robert Mugabe and his party, ZANU-PF. Mugabe's victory would be recognized internationally, and on April 18, 1980, Zimbabwe formally gained independence, with Mugabe as its first prime minister. And with the decisions made at the Lancaster House Agreement having been implemented, the Rhodesian Bush War had now officially and finally come to an end. Now, like I said, whether or not these elections were truly fair and free is still debatable, but there were instances of voter intimidation amongst a few other violent incidents during the elections, but that's something for another time. All in all, though, the Rhodesian Bush War is, in my opinion anyways, one of the most interesting flashpoints of the Cold War, and yet an often overlooked one. It's a conflict that's not just about a local struggle for power, but is a rather powerful microcosm of the broader ideological battle that defined the 20th century. It showcased the complexities of decolonization, the fervor of the nationalist movements all across Africa and in Southeast Asia, and is, at least I think, possibly the most iconic example of the global chess game that was played by the superpowers through proxy wars. But just like that, we've reached the end. Hope you enjoyed this brief little overview. If you did, leave a like, a comment, and subscribe. Or don't. Do what makes you comfortable. But in any case, until next time.